Now for the decade of 1890. It was in the decade of 1890 that there was a spectacular World's Fair held in the city of Chicago. The fair was called the Columbian Exposition, and it was intended to celebrate the 400-year anniversary of Columbus's voyage. And on the screen are pictures from the Columbian Exposition. And this was a huge event. It was the largest and most impressive World's Fair of the time. They had displays from dozens of countries and displays showing the latest and most amazing technological advancements. It included the very first Ferris wheel, which is depicted on the screen. And also, one of the more popular and scandalous events was a belly dancer called Little Egypt, who is also depicted on the screen. And although she would not be considered scandalous today, probably, at the time, in the United States, she was showing more skin than was allowed for women, and she was dancing in ways that did not seem appropriate for people at the time. Now, one of the most spectacular things about the Columbian Exposition is that at nighttime, it was lit up with electric lights. Recall that Edison had just invented the electric light bulb, so this was a brand new thing. It was the latest and greatest technology. However, Edison was not the one who provided the lights for the exposition. This is because Edison was actually on the losing side of what could be called the battle of the currents. That is, so Edison's plan when he invented the light bulb, his plan was to make money by selling the lights and also by generating electricity to run the lights. And Edison's system was based on direct current. That is, where the electric current moves one direction through a wire. However, shortly after Edison began work on a system, Nikola Tesla, a man named Nikola Tesla, developed an alternating current system where the electric current moves back and forth through a wire. And Tesla demonstrated that his system was much better for transmitting electricity over long distances. So they fought back and forth about which system would dominate, and eventually Tesla's system with alternating current is the one that won. It became the system that everyone used. So it was Tesla's alternating current that powered the lights at the World's Fair. And then also in 1895, the very first large-scale power generating plant was constructed at Niagara Falls, which is depicted on the screen now. And that plant was constructed using Tesla's alternating current system. The decade of 1890 was also the decade of the Spanish-American War. So at the time, Cuba was a Spanish colony, and people in Cuba were rebelling against Spanish rule, and they were seeking independence. And then the United States decided to intervene in this conflict. So why did the United States intervene? Well, the reasons may have more to do with powerful and greedy men than anything that might be praiseworthy or good. So it goes like this. There were these men. There was William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And each of these men owned newspapers. And they made a lot of money by publishing sensational stories of the Spanish committing atrocities against the Cuban rebels. But it turns out these stories were actually largely exaggerated, often distorted. Many times they were simply false. They were based on unsubstantiated secondhand information and propaganda from people who were pro-rebel sources. This type of journalism at the time became known as what is called yellow journalism. So their yellow journalism was making them lots of money. And by the way, if you're ever in California, north of San Luis Obispo, you can tour the Hearst Castle, and that reveals the extent of wealth produced by this enterprise. It was a place where William Randolph Hearst lived, and it was an extravagant place. So these newspapermen, they published stories, and these stories sold newspapers. They made the newspaper owners wealthy. And they also pushed public opinion toward believing it was necessary for the United States to intervene on behalf of Cuban rebels. So it was that yellow journalism that was making people think, the United States think, we need to intervene in this war. And then in 1898, something happened. The United States had a battleship called the USS Maine, and it was stationed near Cuba. And there was some kind of an explosion on the ship, and that explosion actually killed many sailors. Now today, historians have concluded that the cause of this explosion is unknown. We don't know what caused it, and it probably had nothing at all to do with Spain. However, at the time, people blamed Spain, and as a result, that became the excuse that the United States used to declare war on Spain. So the United States declares war on Spain, and an interesting piece of the story is that at the time, there was a man named Theodore Roosevelt, who was just at this point rising up in politics, and he was currently serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And so Roosevelt stepped down from this position to command a cavalry unit that was called the Rough Riders. And Roosevelt's Rough Riders fought some battles in the war, and they achieved some famous heroic victories. There are stories of Roosevelt on a horse charging up a hill toward the enemy. And this made Roosevelt famous and gave a great big boost to his future political career. Now, as it turned out, the war lasted only 10 weeks, and the United States defeated Spain. And as a result, the United States took possession of Cuba. Also, the United States took possession of the Philippines, which had also been, the Philippines had previously been a Spanish colony, and so as a result of the war, the United States took possession of the Philippines as well. So now the United States was an empirical power. Notably, in recalling the war at a later date, Theodore Roosevelt once referred to it as a splendid little war. Now, what about Europe? What was going on in Europe during the decade of 1890? Recall that Wilhelm II, that rather narcissistic and immature leader, Wilhelm II had recently become Emperor of Germany, or Prussia. Now, in 1894, Russia gets a new Tsar that also had some problems. Specifically, Nicholas Romanov, or Nicholas II, became Tsar of Russia. And notably, Nicholas, like Wilhelm, is another grandson of Britain's Queen Victoria. Again, these royal people were all related to each other. Now, one issue with Nicholas is simply that he was unprepared to be Tsar. See, Nicholas's father, who was the previous Tsar, he thought that Nicholas was somewhat immature and he really didn't trust Nicholas. So he never gave Nicholas any responsibility or any training. But then his father died rather unexpectedly when he was only 49 years old, suddenly making Nicholas Tsar. Now, Nicholas, he didn't really have any training, and also he was someone who was rather doubtful of his own abilities, and he generally avoided disagreement. At the same time, he grew up in a very privileged, sheltered life, the life of royalty, and he often seemed naive and isolated from people, and he seemed unaware of the life experience of the common people in Russia. He was also strongly devoted to the Russian Orthodox Christianity that was the main religion in Russia at the time. And he believed it was his destiny and responsibility from God to rule Russia. He also was very devoted to his wife, Alexandra. And Alexandra was a German princess, and she was also yet another grandchild of Queen Victoria. So Nicholas and Alexandra, they actually married against the advice of many people because he was Russian and she was German, and people were concerned about that. The picture on your screen, I believe, is a picture of Nicholas and Alexandra at the time of their wedding. Now, one of their struggles was the fact that culture demanded that Alexandria, she needed to bear a son to inherit the throne. But their first 4 children were all daughters. And although they appear to have loved their daughters greatly, this was viewed as a disappointment. They were failing because the people wanted them to have a son. Then finally, their fifth child was a son. However, he had hemophilia, and that has to do with the fact that Nicholas and Alexandria were related to each other. So there are many occasions where their son got trivial small injuries, but they caused bleeding that left their son bedridden for days, and oftentimes he'd be near death for weeks. So he was very ill. And although, as we will see, or you may already know this family met a terrible fate, but it is probably unlikely the disease would have allowed their son to live to adulthood. So the family, and actually especially Alexandria, they sought help, especially for their son and his hemophilia. They sought help from a man named Rasputin. And Rasputin was a mystic and a prophet and a holy man that they believed had healing power. And Rasputin, he spent a lot of time with this royal family. So overall, in general, Nicholas, with his German wife, with his difficulty producing a son for an heir, with his involvement with Rasputin, and with his general lack of understanding of what it's like for the common German people, overall, he was simply not a highly popular person among the Russian people. Now let's go back to the United States and consider attitudes towards immigration at the time. Recall that the United States had recently enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, and so now in the decade of 1890 there is further interest in the idea of immigration restriction. Specifically, in 1894, the Immigration Restriction League was founded by 3 alumni from Harvard University. One of the founders was Prescott F. Hall, who is depicted in the picture. And so, consistent with the racist academic theories that were really popular at the time, and consistent with Galton's ideas about eugenics, this group advocated for laws to restrict immigration to the United States. They were especially concerned about immigrants from southern and eastern parts of Europe, who they believed would bring poverty and crime and dilute the quality of the American people. Now, this organization would grow in size over the next few decades. Now, the important thing, though, that I want to point out here is that this group was not a fringe group. The elitist attitudes proposed by this group were the attitudes that appealed to academics at this point in time. Note that the organization was founded by alumni from Harvard University, one of the most prestigious schools. And Prescott Hall traveled in the same social circles as some early psychologists. For example, he was a member of the American Society for Psychical Research, and we'll say more about that group a bit later on. But the thing to note now is that group included people like William James and Henry Bowditch, and also Stanley Hall, although Hall later dropped out of that group because he was critical of their research. So the key thing is that to note that Prescott Hall, he was traveling in the same social circles as some of the first psychologists. And so the first psychologists were people that socialized with an elite group of people that was drawn towards ideas of immigration restriction.
Sunlight dancing on the crest of ceaseless, frightening waves, no feeling, thought, or rest. Peace fills the salty air.
So what about racism? What types of racism were common in the United States during the decade of 1890? Well, it was during the decade of 1890 that the Supreme Court gave the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. It ruled in favor of what it inaccurately called separate but equal accommodations for black and white people. And this ruling supported racist segregation laws in the South, sometimes referred to as Jim Crow laws. These laws mandated that black and white people had to have different schools and had to be segregated in public places and when using public transportation. Now, this ruling it specifically involved a law in Louisiana that required black and white people to ride separate rail cars when traveling on the railroad. So, in a planned test of the law, a black man named Homer Plessy purchased a first-class ticket on the East Louisiana Railroad, and he attempted to ride the car for white people. He was then removed from the train, arrested, and he spent a night in jail, and then he was released on bond. So this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice Henry Billings, writing the Supreme Court majority opinion, he stated, quote, "If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane." Notably, at the time, this ruling was not considered important news. For example, it was only printed on the 3rd page of the New York Times. So, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court upholds segregation. And in the South, white people used many violent and horrific methods to enforce white supremacy, to oppress black people, and to ensure that black people were subjugated to white control. One of these methods could be described as a new form of slavery. So white people made laws that essentially only applied to black people and that essentially criminalized black life. For example, if a black man could not prove that he was employed by a white person, he might be charged with vagrancy. So, black people, and especially black men, would be arrested and charged with violating these frivolous laws. Then they would be charged a fine, and the fine would be something they could not pay. So, because they could not pay the fine, they would be required to pay off the fine through hard labor. So the person would then become a convict, and the convict would then be leased to a private company. For example, many of these convicts were leased to mining companies where they were forced to dig mines. And because these companies were only leasing the convicts, and because dead convicts could easily be replaced, they had no financial interest in the well-being of the convicts. So these convicts were often forced to work in inhumane, terrible, horrific conditions. Sometimes they were chained together. They were typically without adequate clothing or adequate food or adequate sanitation. Oftentimes they were punished by whipping, using the very same methods that were used when slavery was legal. And death rates in these labor camps were quite high. But most white people at the time were not too much concerned about this, probably in part because they assumed, well, the convicts were all criminals. It is also around this time when the lynching of black people was especially common. There arose in the South a kind of a lynching culture. And estimates are that in the United States, for example, between the years 1890 and 1930, that about one person was lynched every 4 days on average in the United States. And for example, in the year 1892, one estimate is that over 250 people were lynched that year. So lynching was a form of terrorism that enforced both the legal and the unwritten rules of white supremacy. And a lynching was a kind of a public event, almost a type of entertainment for white people. And lots of people would attend. It would include men and women and children. It was common for hundreds or even thousands of people to come and attend a lynching as a kind of entertainment for white people. And after a lynching, people would sometimes save body parts of the victim. They would cut off and save these body parts as souvenirs for the lynching. And it was common, especially a little bit later around the turn of the century, for people to treat lynching photography as a type of art form. People would take pictures of lynchings. They would sell these pictures. They would turn these pictures into postcards. The picture on the screen is an example of a lynching postcard that arose from this lynching culture in the South. Now let's pick up on our story of Sigmund Freud. So it is in 1895 now, finally, that Breuer and Freud published their book, Studies on Hysteria. This is the book that described the case of Anna O and how Breuer used the talking cure to produce catharsis. So they finally published their book in 1895. And it's also around this time, during the decade of 1890, that Freud begins a friendship with Wilhelm Fliess. And the two men are pictured here. That's Freud on the left and Fliess on the right on your screen. And these two men frequently talked with each other, and they wrote each other a lot of letters and correspondence. And in this correspondence, they discussed their theories. They talked with each other quite a bit about their theories. Now, Fliess was a nose specialist, and he had some very interesting ideas. For example, he thought that both men and women had these cycles, kind of like monthly cycles, and he thought both men and women had these cycles, and these cycles were focused on the nose. And he also thought that people had what he called genital spots on the interior of their noses. So he had a lot of interesting ideas about the importance of noses. Also, one thing that might have inspired Freud is that he believed that childhood events could have lasting consequences for people. Notably, Freud would sometimes refer his patients to Fliess to have special nose operations performed that were supposed to help them with various things. At one point, actually, it turns out Fliess botched an operation on one of Freud's patients, and he left a piece of gauze in her nose. And then later, another person had to do another operation to remove the gauze that Fliess had left in that woman's nose. So it was around this time that Freud begins to develop what has been called his seduction theory of hysteria. Now, recall that when Freud was in Paris, he heard Charcot talking about hysterical symptoms and how they're a matter of sex. And as we just noted, his friend Fliess has some interesting idea about sexual spots in the nose. So initially now, Freud's theory is this. His theory is that hysterical symptoms are representations of an earlier, what he called sexual shock. In other words, he thought people with hysteria were all victims of childhood sexual abuse. And notably, he actually proposed this theory to Fliess in November of 1895. And then by April, he reported having 18 cases fitting his theory. Notably, many scholars have raised questions about whether it's realistic to find that many cases supporting his theory in so short of a time, going just from November to April. And people wonder if it seems like he probably first came up with his theory, and then maybe Freud inadvertently persuaded his patients to come up with appropriate memories to support his theory. Along this line, one notable technique that he used to uncover these memories in his patients was something called a pressure technique. So he used this pressure technique to help his hysterical women come up with their memories. And what he did is he actually literally put pressure on the patients' foreheads to help them recover memories. Notably, now he later changed his seduction theory, where initially he said that the women with hysteria had all experienced sexual abuse, or this sexual shock that he called it. Later he changed his mind and said, well, these weren't actually events that actually happened, but rather these women with hysteria have fantasies about being seduced by their fathers, and then later they suppress these fantasies, and that leads to the hysteria. So although the original theory was based on questionable methods, it maybe could have called attention to sexual abuse, but then his later theory serves to deny the extent and consequences of sexual abuse. Now let's pick up with our story of James McKean Cattell and Lightner Witmer. On the screen is a picture of Cattell and his research lab that we've seen before. And recall that where we left them last, Cattell was a brand new faculty member at University of Pennsylvania, and there he had a brand new psychology research lab that was well funded, and Lightner Witmer was his brand new graduate student. So what happened is this. After just a few years at Pennsylvania, Cattell gets an offer from another school. He gets an offer from Columbia College in New York, and he accepts that offer. And so Cattell leaves University of Pennsylvania, and he moves to join the faculty of Columbia College in New York. And when he gets there, he continues basically his same line of research where he's doing his mental tests, and he's testing all kinds of human traits and abilities. And actually there he begins testing all the incoming freshman students that are coming into Columbia College, and he tests them with his mental tests. Also, notably in 1894, Cattell establishes another psychology journal, and his journal is titled Psychological Review. Recall, by the way, that Stanley Hall was the person that established the first psychology journal in the United States. And recall that Cattell did not like Stanley Hall. That is, Cattell first started studying with Stanley Hall. Stanley Hall was a person that canceled his fellowship, and so Cattell and Hall had some kind of a falling out there. And so Cattell probably did not like Stanley Hall, and he probably didn't care for Stanley Hall's journal. And so Cattell establishes his psychology journal, which is probably set up to be kind of an alternative or within competition to Stanley Hall's psychology journal. So anyway, Cattell leaves Pennsylvania, and of course that creates some difficulties at University of Pennsylvania, because it would mean now there's no one there to run that fancy new psychology laboratory that they just funded. And it also means that Lightner Witmer now has no advisor for his graduate work. So what are they going to do? Well, they come to this a solution, and what they do is they make an arrangement for Lightner Witmer to go to Germany and study with Wilhelm Wundt. And University of Pennsylvania agrees that they will pay Witmer a stipend to go to Germany and complete his degree there with Wundt, with the idea that when he's done and he has his degree, he will come back and join the faculty at University of Pennsylvania, and then he will pick up and be the lead on that lab, that fancy new psychology lab that they just funded. He will then take over in leading that lab. So that's exactly what Witmer did. Witmer goes to Germany and he studies with Wilhelm Wundt, and he completes his doctoral degree with Wilhelm Wundt. Notably, knowing that Witmer is going to go on eventually to become the very first clinical psychologist, the topic of his dissertation might seem a little bit surprising. So for his doctoral dissertation, he did this. He had a sample of 14 men look at rectangles and other geometric forms and rate which ones they found most pleasing, that is, which ones they liked the most. And as part of this, he evaluated shapes with what I believe experts in visual art would call a golden section rectangle. I believe that's a type of rectangle in which the width is about 2/3 of the length. The picture on the screen is just some random picture I found that's supposed to illustrate this golden section. So Witmer had 14 men looking at rectangles and geometric forms, rating how much they found these shapes pleasing. Notably, one thing about this is that Witmer's work here shows that he was influenced by Cattell and Cattell's interest in individual differences. Because where Wundt really didn't care about looking at differences between people, for his dissertation, Witmer spent time discussing individual differences in what people found most pleasing. That is, he looked at the differences between those 14 men looking at rectangles and what they found most pleasing. So Witmer completes his PhD with Wundt, and then just exactly as planned, he returns to University of Pennsylvania to fill Cattell's vacated position. So Witmer returns to the United States and starts his position at University of Pennsylvania in 1892. And as it turns out, this is also the exact same year that Stanley Hall establishes the American Psychological Association, or the APA, the American Psychological Association. Now, by this time in history, there were a handful of academics in the United States who had become interested in this new psychology. And in 1892, Stanley Hall organizes the first APA meeting. They start off with just an initial organizational meeting that includes only Stanley Hall and William James and Cattell and a couple other people. And then they invite about 26 other psychologists to join them for the very first APA meeting. And so that first meeting had less than 40 people. It was held at University of Pennsylvania. And interestingly, the original budget for the APA for that first year, the original budget was a whopping $63 for the first year of the APA budget. And then they elected Stanley Hall to be the first president of the American Psychological Association. So in addition to that list of all the other things that Stanley Hall was the first at doing, he was also the very first president of the American Psychological Association. Not only is 1892 the year that Lightner Witmer returned to the United States and the year of the very first APA meeting, but it's also the year when two other important people will immigrate to the United States. And these two other people are also students who studied with Wilhelm Wundt in Germany and got their degrees with Wilhelm Wundt, and people that then came to the United States and were very influential in the new psychology movement here. And these two people are Edward Titchener, who joined the faculty at Cornell, and Hugo Münsterberg, who joined William James at Harvard University. And these two people will become very influential along with Lightner Witmer in the growing psychology movement in the United States. So what that means is we're now at a point in our story where we essentially have the very first cohort of psychologists in the United States. Let's see, here we have William James and Hall and Cattell, and there's Witmer and Titchener and Münsterberg, and then another person we haven't talked about yet, but there's Thorndike is down at the bottom there. So we have this first cohort. And what this means is we now have in the United States a new academic discipline of psychology. And we can ask the question, so what is this new psychology like? But before we answer that question, let's take a moment to consider another question about the historical setting. Let's ask the question, what type of psychology is this historical setting likely to produce? If we consider the historical setting, what type of psychology do we think is likely to come out of it? So here's the historical setting. We've talked about this to just summarize what we've been talking about up to this point. We've talked about, here's the foundation. So we have the development of evolution. So we have Darwin's theory of evolution, and that's very influential. We have Wilhelm Wundt and Francis Galton, who are developing different ways of assessing people. So Wundt and Galton have devised many ways of assessing people. And at this point, we have a relatively crude understanding of the brain and the nervous system. For example, Broca's area has been identified, and people are beginning to have a basic understanding of the function of nerves. So that's our foundation. What are the historical limitations at this point in history? Well, one thing is all the academics are essentially this elite class of men that are receiving graduate education. So you look at this group here, it's all an elite class of white males, and that will probably limit their perspective in this new psychology. Also, it's not quite clear yet what the definition of psychology is. There's not yet clear a definition of what psychology is, and there's not really a definition of what methods should be used to study it. Wundt has one approach, Galton has another approach, and much of the writing at the time seems to be comprised of actually philosophical speculation based on anecdotal evidence. So people are using all kinds of methods to talk about this new psychology. It's not quite clear yet how psychology is defined or what methods should be used to study psychology. Notably, there's limitations at this point in history in technology and medicine. For example, at technology, we talked about how light bulbs are just brand new. Most people don't have them yet, so people don't have electricity yet. A lot of people don't have indoor plumbing yet. Transportation, if you want to get from here to there, mostly you walk or you use a horse or you use a train or a boat, but this is before we had cars, for example. If you want to communicate over a long distance, you're still limited to just using a telegraph if you want to communicate over a long distance. And then in medicine, we have antiseptic surgery and germ theory are still brand new. They're only starting to catch on. So there's a lot of limitations at this point in history in terms of technology and medicine. We're still not very advanced yet. And as we've been talking about, we're in a world filled with racism. Certainly our world today is filled with racism, but at this point in time, it certainly is quite overt. Racism at this point in time is overt, it's violent, it's pervasive in culture, and it is the norm among academics. In addition to racism, we also have a lot of sexism at this point in time in history. So women at this point, women cannot vote. Women are largely excluded from academics. And again, our pictures here on this page, these are all men and they're all white. So women are excluded from academics, and these white men mostly believed that women were less intelligent than them. So a lot of sexism at this point in time as well. And in terms of statistics, there's only rudimentary ideas are just now beginning to develop. So the basic formulas for things like standard deviation and correlation were only recently invented, and they're not yet widely known or widely used. So at this point, data analysis is limited mostly to simply tabulating sums and averages and percentages and things like that. So now, given this foundation and given these limitations, what type of psychology will arise out of this historical setting? So to see what this new psychology looks like, what I'm going to do is take a brief look at each of the psychologists from this new cohort and see what they were doing. Now, on the one hand, we will find there's some overlapping interests between these psychologists. They share interest in things like evolution, in Galton, in Wundt, and eugenics. On the other hand, each one of these psychologists seems to be pursuing his own unique version of psychology. So to organize this section, I have a descriptive label for each psychologist, and these descriptive labels would be placed in green boxes on the following screens. And so what I'm going to do is that for each psychologist, I will give you the descriptive label, and then I'll show you how the psychologist fits that label. So let's start with William James. And my description of William James is that he pursued a philosophical psychology with an open-minded discussion of theory influenced by evolution. So let's see how that is. Now, one thing to know about William James is that actually in 1890, he finally publishes his textbook, which is named Principles of Psychology. This is something that took him about 12 years to complete. He actually started it on his honeymoon. He finally finishes it, and this becomes the very first textbook on psychology in the United States. And it also becomes essentially the standard text for psychology in the United States for many years. So one of the key ways that William James had an influence on this new discipline of psychology is he wrote the first textbook and the textbook that became the standard textbook for psychology for quite a while. Now, when we look at the way that James approached psychology, and this is true in general, and we would also see it if we looked at his textbook as well, is that his approach to psychology includes a lot of philosophical speculation and a lot of things that are based on essentially anecdotal evidence. And now many other psychologists were opposed to this. So William James was somewhat controversial in this respect, in that was a method that he often used, but a lot of other psychologists disagreed with it. Now, one thing I have in my description here is I describe William James as being open-minded. He had an open-minded discussion of theory. So how was William James open-minded? Well, one way that he was open-minded is that he had an interest in spiritualism and psychical phenomena. One person he was interested in is this person on the page here, who's Mrs. Piper. And Mrs. Piper was a medium who conducted seances, and James was especially interested in her, and he often went to her seances and he followed what she was doing, and he seemed to think that she had some kind of unexplainable psychic powers. So he was especially interested in Miss Piper, and he wrote a lot about things that he discovered when he went to see Miss Piper. Then in 1884, William James was a co-founder of a group that was called the Society for Psychical Research. And this is a group of people, it included people both in the United States and in England. And it was a group that could be described as a group of academics that had a skeptical acceptance of psychical phenomena. That is, they were kind of skeptical, but they accepted a lot of things as well. And they sought to test the claims of mediums. And sometimes they said, well, I think this person's a fake or they're using tricks. But sometimes they concluded that mediums were doing things that had no explanation. This is the same group, I actually mentioned it a little while ago, that included Prescott F. Hall. That was the person who was part of that anti-immigration movement. So that was a group that included Prescott Hall. And James was a key leader of that organization, of that Society for Psychical Research. I also have a note on the page here that says mind cure, and that's because James was also supportive of that mind cure movement. He didn't really necessarily believe it wholeheartedly, but he thought, well, it might be true and it's worth pursuing. It was kind of his attitude towards it. And recall the mind cure, that's that movement that had the idea that illness and health can be related to what you believe. And if you have some kind of illness, if you believe you're going to get cured, or if you believe you're going to get better, then you will be. And that was the mind cure movement. And William James, he wasn't necessarily a follower of it, but he had some interest in it, and he generally was supportive towards the idea. And now there were a lot of psychologists that didn't like this part of William James. Recall that Stanley Hall had his journal, and that journal had an initial article in it that was critical of the psychic movement, and that led to the journal founder withdrawing his support for it, and Stanley Hall was left with a whole bunch of debt. And so Stanley Hall did not like this psychical movement, and he didn't like the idea of psychology, this new discipline of psychology, getting mixed up with psychical research. And a lot of other psychologists agreed. For example, Cattell also he actually wrote several articles criticizing James for his interest in psychic research. And they were concerned, here we have this brand new discipline, psychology. People don't know what it is yet. And if we start doing stuff with this psychic phenomena, they're going to get all mixed up, and they're not going to understand that we're doing legitimate science, and we're going to get confused with this psychic stuff, which is not scientific. So there were a lot of psychologists that were opposed to William James' interest in psychical phenomena.
Forests and rivers, glaciers and oceans, particles and neurons, human emotion swirls, a kaleidoscope of beauty so wide. Sometimes I pause and
So here is a picture of William James on the right and his brother Henry James, the famous author, on the left. And I described William James' approach to psychology as a philosophical psychology with an open-minded discussion of theory influenced by evolution. So the idea there is that it's a philosophical approach that involves a lot of philosophical ideas about theory, and he's discussing these theoretical ideas, not so much doing research on them. So he's not so much collecting data and doing empirical studies, but rather it's more of a philosophical discussion about these theoretical ideas with a lot of anecdotal evidence. And it's also an approach that's where he has a strong influence in evolution as well. And part of what drives this whole approach is that he's a very skilled writer. He's very effective at using metaphors to illustrate his philosophical ideas. His discussion of theory is supported by good writing and a lot of metaphors. So if we look at his theory, we're not going to come away with, oh, here's what his theory is. It's not going to gel together like a coherent single theory that is William James' theory, but rather we can look at the things he wrote and see how he used this philosophical discussion of theory, and see how that was his approach to doing psychology. So let's see how he used that open-minded discussion of theory in his philosophical and anecdotal approach to psychology. Here's some examples. So one thing I note here is that he liked evolutionary theory, and he described consciousness. So a lot of psychologists at this point in time were interested in conscious experience. Recall that's what Wilhelm Wundt was looking at in Germany. He was trying to understand conscious experience. So a lot of psychologists were interested in the idea of consciousness. And William James' focus was that consciousness should be adaptive. And so one of his philosophical ideas is that, drawing from evolutionary theory, was that consciousness is adaptive. And where some people tried to divide consciousness into parts. In fact, we'll talk about Edward Titchener in just a moment. And Titchener had an idea of structuralism where he tried to take conscious experience and divide it into different components. And William James said, no, I don't think you can do that. He said that consciousness is like a stream. And he used the phrase, a stream of consciousness. So that's one of William James' metaphors. He describes consciousness as a stream. And note, this isn't really something that's based on some kind of empirical evidence, but it's an anecdote that works fairly well. It's kind of a metaphor that says, oh yeah, consciousness is like a stream. It's continually flowing and it's always changing. You can't pull out a piece of consciousness and say, well, here's one component and there's another component, because consciousness is like a stream that's always changing. Actually, William James is also famous for his theory of emotion, which is has later been called the James Lange theory of emotion. There's another person, Lange, who also had a similar idea. And the James Lange theory of emotion is essentially that people first engage in behavioral responses to a stimuli, and then we notice how we're behaviorally responding to a stimuli. Oh, I'm running away, or I'm sweating, or my heart is pounding. So we note our behavioral responses, and then we perceive the emotions. So his theory is that first we have this behavioral response, and then we experience the emotion. And again, this is pretty much his own philosophical speculation. He's not actually collecting data to demonstrate this, but it's something that he's based on his logical reasoning and anecdotal evidence he pulls up, comes to that conclusion. A lot of his ideas focus on habits. He was interested in how people form habits, and I suppose if there's any theme in his theory, he talks a whole lot about humans developing habits. At one point, he describes habits as the enormous flywheel in society, which is a great vivid metaphor if you know what a flywheel is. If you don't know what a flywheel is, and that's will probably get lost in it. So a flywheel is a huge or a heavy wheel that if you get it turning, it has a lot of inertia and keeps on wanting to turn. It keeps on wanting to spin once you get it turning. So a flywheel is a big, heavy wheel that once you get it going, it doesn't want to stop. So he's saying that habits are like the enormous flywheel of society. Habits are what makes society go. And also talking about habits, he had another metaphor he used. This is when you get to age 30, most people are set in plaster, or they're set like plaster because of the habits we develop. By the age of 30, most people are set like plaster. He had also an interest in a thing he called the moral equivalent of war. And that's the idea that he had an idea that, well, people have this unexpressed fighting qualities that can accumulate and they bottle up. And he said these are fighting qualities bottle up like water behind a dam waiting to burst. And so we need to find some kind of non-violent way for humans to release this instinct so we don't end up going to war and killing each other. So that was his idea about moral equivalent in war. And one of my favorites of his phrases is the idea of one great blooming, buzzing confusion. So his idea was here, and this is kind of more this philosophical speculation, that when people are born, that their senses really aren't connected, that you have your senses like your touch and smell and vision, that you have these, the baby gets all these different types of sensory input, but these senses are not yet integrated together in a way that makes sense. And so he thought that when babies were born, again, this is basically philosophical speculation, that babies are born into one great blooming, buzzing confusion. So we see in all that, again, the evidence here, it's not that we can take that and say, okay, here's exactly what William James' theory was, but rather we certainly see he had a lot of philosophical speculation with anecdotal evidence and ideas that were supported by great writing and very vivid metaphors. And that was probably William James' key contribution to psychology. And here's another picture of William James on the left with one of his colleagues from Harvard on the right. And one thing that fits with the idea that William James' approach to psychology was a philosophical approach is the fact that later in his life, he really considered himself more of a philosopher than a psychologist. And as a philosopher, William James was someone who disliked positivism. That is, positivism would be a belief that valid knowledge is based only on facts that could be scientifically supported. And so he wanted to get facts that went beyond science. He saw empirical investigation as requiring elements of faith, and he believed that it was legitimate and necessary to step outside of science to answer many psychological questions. So he disliked positivism. And later in his life, he actually formed a particular philosophical theory that was called pragmaticism. So pragmaticism is not really psychology, it's philosophy, and it's the philosophical system that William James came up with later in his life. And pragmaticism is essentially that if a belief in something produces a practical benefit, then that belief must be true for the person receiving the benefit. So it's kind of an idea that truth is not absolute and that one person's truth should not be forced on another person. So it's a type of philosophy focusing on ways in which truth can be relative and how what determines if something is true or not has more to do with, well, what are the effects of the belief? So if this belief produces some kind of an effect, then, well, that belief has some truth to it. And if the belief doesn't produce an effect, well, then I guess for that person, that belief is not so much true. And so later in his life, he focused on pragmaticism and became much more interested in philosophy than psychology. And to close out our discussion of William James, I have just one more picture that I didn't have anything to put it with, but here's a picture of William James and his family, his wife and daughter, and again, his brother Henry, who's the famous author on the far right. I notice every time I see Henry in a picture, he has his head tilted towards William James. So that's William James. Next, let's consider Hugo Münsterberg. And my description of Münsterberg is that he pursued a popular psychology exploring an eclectic mix of applied topics. So let's see how that is. Now, Münsterberg is one of the people I just mentioned a moment ago that studied with Wilhelm Wundt and immigrated to the United States in 1892. He's the person that joined William James at Harvard. And actually, we have a picture of Münsterberg when he was a child. Here is Münsterberg and his family when Münsterberg was 7 years old. So whichever child in that picture is a 7-year-old child, that should be Münsterberg. So Münsterberg, actually, he was born in Prussia, so he was in the same area as Wundt. And he went and joined Wundt's lab and got his doctoral degree with Wundt. And it seems like Münsterberg might have been somewhat of a rebellious student in Wundt's lab. He didn't always agree with Wundt, at least. At one point, Münsterberg did an introspection experiment, and he said that will, like your voluntary will to do things, he said that will is not part of consciousness. And that went against Wundt's ideas. It might seem like kind of a trivial thing now, and I'm not even sure how you would determine if it's true or not. It could lead to that kind of circular reasoning of there's no way to disprove or prove it either way. But part of Wundt's theory was that your voluntary will is part of consciousness, and Münsterberg claimed that it wasn't. Another thing, Münsterberg claimed that muscular sensations were the basis of awareness. And that really didn't agree with Wundt's theory, although it's something that seems somewhat similar to James' idea of emotion, how we have these bodily sensations and we sense those bodily sensations, and that in turn leads to emotion. And maybe that's why James actually kind of liked Münsterberg's ideas. So anyway, Münsterberg completes his PhD with Wundt. And then one very important thing to note about Münsterberg is that after that, he went on and completed a medical degree. He became a medical doctor. And so, and that's one thing to keep in mind as we look at Münsterberg's career. He was both trained as a psychologist with Wundt, but then he was also at the same time a medical doctor. So after getting his doctoral degree with Wundt and then going on and getting his medical degree, Münsterberg spent a few years teaching at the University of Freiburg. And here is actually a picture of Münsterberg and his lab when he was teaching at Freiburg. And it's kind of a fun picture because at this point in history, a lot of pictures we see, people look very, very serious. And this picture looks like they were kind of having fun with it. It's kind of like, okay, everybody grab your favorite piece of psychological testing equipment and pose for the picture. So we see, let's see, that's Münsterberg is in the very center here. That would be Münsterberg there. And what's here? That looks like a chronoscope up here, and here's maybe a color wheel over here. So a lot of psychological equipment they're using. The color wheel would be something would have different colors on it. They'd spin it, and the colors would blend together. And also note, it looks like there's a woman in the picture right next to Münsterberg over here. I don't know what her role was in the lab, if she was a member of the lab or did something else, but it's interesting to note it looks like there's a woman in the picture.
All of my senses, all my emotion, may they bring me closer, put me in motion to a kaleidoscope of beauty so wide. Sometimes I pause and tremble inside. May I feel the joy, may I hope, may I grieve. Give me compassion, let me believe. Even my sadness, anger, and fear, drawing me closer, drawing me near.
So it was while Münsterberg was at Freiburg that William James sought him out and asked him to come to the United States and come to Harvard to run a psychology lab at Harvard. In the picture, you see a picture of Emerson Hall, which is the building that would have housed the School of Philosophy at the time, and that is where the psychology department was located. So, as we've seen, William James tended to take a more philosophical, anecdotal approach to psychology. And he didn't have an impressive research laboratory, and he really didn't seem interested in conducting his own research. However, he recognized the need for research, and he believed that Harvard needed one of those fancy new psychology research labs. He just didn't want to be the one who did it. So he hoped that Münsterberg would come to the United States, that Münsterberg would come to Harvard and establish a fancy research lab at Harvard. And I think they went back and forth a bit, but eventually, it took a while, but William James eventually convinced Münsterberg to come to the United States, and Münsterberg arrived in 1892. Again, that's the same year that Witmer and Titchener arrived, and the same year as that very first APA meeting. Notably, initially, Münsterberg could not even speak or understand English, so I presume his students were expected to know German and just follow along in German. But eventually, he became proficient in English. One interesting note about Münsterberg is at one point he had an occasion to give advice to the President of the United States, who was President Taft at that point in time. And he advised the President of the United States that he thought, I think your wife should seek psychological help rather than drink whiskey. That seems like a rather bold or unusual thing to give advice to a President of the United States. And I'm not sure exactly what led up to it, but I do know this. I do know that actually President Taft's wife had actually had a stroke, and she was aphasic. She was unable to speak. I don't know if that's what Münsterberg was thinking of or something else, but it seems like rather bold advice to give a president. Now, notably, Münsterberg's role in the history of psychology in the United States, his role was probably eventually somewhat limited later in his life, because around the time of World War I, so several years later, during World War I, Münsterberg supported Germany. I mean, he was from the area, and he actually wanted Germany and the United States to get along with each other. He wanted people in Germany to understand people in the United States. He wanted people in the United States to understand people in Germany. So around the time of World War I, Münsterberg was supportive of Germany. But this was a very unpopular opinion in the United States around that time. So Münsterberg started receiving hate mail, and people asked Harvard to fire him. And I think after that point, other psychologists may have kind of backed off from Münsterberg. They may have been reluctant to give Münsterberg credit and may have been reluctant to pursue Münsterberg's ideas because he'd become somewhat of a controversial person. Now, I describe Münsterberg's psychology as a popular psychology, and I describe it as a popular psychology because he was good at popularizing his ideas. Now, as I mentioned, eventually Münsterberg became a controversial person, but for most of his career before that, he was very effective at publicizing and popularizing his work, and he did a good job of making it accessible to the general public. He wrote many things for the general population, including articles in magazines and newspapers. And I have a couple pictures here of Münsterberg's research lab that are taken from magazine articles. So you're looking at one picture here that shows Münsterberg's lab, and we see all kinds of, again, more psychological equipment around the room here. It looks like over here some people are looking into some kind of a visual box or something like that. This person over here looks like he's got his hand on some kind of a trigger, maybe doing a reaction time experiment. We see some more, maybe these look like color wheels up here. So here's a picture of Münsterberg's research lab. Gives you a feel both of what his lab looked like and also a way that he popularized his psychology, because this is something that was published in a magazine. And let's see, here's another picture from Münsterberg's lab. I think it's from the same magazine article. It's labeled as the chain reaction experiment. So they're demonstrating some kind of psychological experiment. I'm not sure what they're doing, although notably all the people in the picture look like they're white males, as we've seen at this point in history is a very common thing. And also note that looks on the chalkboard back here, it looks like someone's drawn a picture of a brain back there. So Münsterberg was very effective in popularizing his ideas and published pictures of his lab in magazines. And here's another picture of Münsterberg. And I describe Münsterberg as exploring an eclectic mix of applied topics. And when I say applied, I'm thinking of things that can be applied to real life, things that might help people in some way. Now, at this point in history, many psychologists were pursuing more of a pure science. They were investigating things like conscious experience and sensation and perception with the goal of just trying to understand these things. They were just trying to gain scientific understanding without any expectation that the result of their research would prove helpful for people in any way. So they weren't trying to produce knowledge that would help people. They were just trying to understand for the sake of understanding. In contrast, Münsterberg explored topics that had applied value that could potentially help people. And I call this an eclectic mix of applied topics because he explored many different things. And as we look at the things that he considered, it seems like the topics he looked at seem especially relevant to what we look at today in modern psychology. So he addressed topics that seem especially relevant to modern psychology. Things that are going to be relevant to things like clinical psychology, forensic psychology, industrial organizational psychology, for example. So for example, for clinical psychology, now he never called himself a clinical psychologist, and we don't consider Münsterberg as the first clinical psychologist, but he did do research on, or he did do psychotherapy. Now, he did it as a medical doctor and not a psychologist, but he had an approach to trying to do psychotherapy with people with what today we might call mental disorders. His approach sometimes involved simply trying to make patients expect to improve, maybe kind of like that mind cure, make them believe they're going to improve and see if that helps them. He did something that he called reciprocal antagonism, where he tried to reinforce the opposite of some kind of problematic behavior. He made use of hypnotism, and notably, in 1909, he published a book called Psychotherapy. So he did a lot of work with psychotherapy, which would be relevant to clinical psychology today. Now, I mentioned that Lightner Witmer will become the first clinical psychologist. And you might wonder why that is, because if we compare Witmer and Münsterberg, Witmer will seem like he's doing something that's much more closer to what today we would call school psychology, and Münsterberg will seem like he's doing something that's much closer to what today we would call clinical psychology. We'll see that Witmer was mostly conducting assessments with school children, whereas Münsterberg was doing psychotherapy, which seems much more like what clinical psychologists do today. So why isn't Münsterberg the first clinical psychologist? Well, a big part of that reason is that when Münsterberg was doing his work, he was doing it, he had a medical degree, he was a medical doctor, and when he did psychotherapy, he claimed to be doing it as a medical doctor, just like Freud or Charcot. And he didn't do it using his credentials as a psychologist. In fact, he believed that someone who was merely a psychologist would not have the credentials to do psychotherapy. So he did psychotherapy, but he did it as a medical doctor, and he didn't see that as something that was part of the realm of psychology. And so for that reason, we don't consider him a clinical psychologist. He never claimed to be a clinical psychologist and never would have used that word. But he did do a lot of work with psychotherapy. He also did work with forensic psychology, looking at psychology as it relates to legal issues. He actually wrote a book on forensic psychology that was called On the Witness Stand, published in 1908. His approach involved a mix. He used both a lot of anecdotal stories, he used a lot of philosophical speculation, kind of like William James did, but he also had some results from demonstrations that were done like in classes. Like for example, he'd have some situations where he'd stage something in a class. He'd be teaching a class, and he'd stage an event where maybe there'd be a fight that would break out, or someone would happen and someone would actually shoot a gun or something like that. So some kind of dramatic event would happen during a class, and it would all be staged. And then after the event, he'd ask people to write down what they recall happening. And then he essentially did kind of a qualitative analysis of what people wrote down to make judgments about how accurately people could remember the events. After being a witness to an event, how accurately can people witness it? And he came to the conclusion that eyewitness testimony is actually not very reliable, and that confessions are often not true, or not always true. Which today we know that's actually, there's a lot of, he was actually largely accurate in that result, that eyewitness testimony often is not very reliable. At the time, he was often ridiculed and attacked by lawyers. He also did an experiment on juries, and he found that men, if they just try to make their decisions by themselves, they make correct judgments 52% of the time. But if there's a group discussion, like in a jury, they're correct 78% of the time. So he came to the conclusion that in a jury, a group discussion, his conclusion was that improves the accuracy of the decision. Notably, he also thought that women were not capable of rational discussion in groups, and so he didn't think that a woman on a jury made sense, or that the group discussion in a jury would help a woman, because he didn't think they were capable of that type of rational discussion, which again illustrates the type of sexism that was common at this point in history. One interesting fact about Münsterberg's forensic psychology is that he had a student named William Moulton, who at one point actually developed a lie detector test based on blood pressure. And then later, William Moulton went on to develop the character of Wonder Woman, the cartoon character Wonder Woman, who I believed had a lasso that would help people tell the truth or not. And then finally, I know he did work with industrial psychology or industrial organizational psychology. He developed tests for selecting employees, like tests for railway drivers and telephone operators, to help employers decide who should they hire, who would be good at different jobs they had. Notably, he also at one point claimed, as part of his industrial psychology, that people are generally not bored with monotonous jobs. I'm not sure what led him to that conclusion, but that was one of his conclusions. So you see clinical stuff with psychotherapy, forensic psychology, industrial psychology, kind of, I call that an eclectic mix of applied topics, and that's Hugo Münsterberg. The next person is Edward Titchener, and my description for Titchener is that he pursued a laboratory psychology where researchers test their own sensation. So let's see how that is. So now, Titchener, he was one of those people that studied with Wilhelm Wundt and immigrated to the United States in 1892. That was the same time as Münsterberg and also Lightner Witmer. And he's the one that went to Cornell University. And Titchener was English. He was from England, born in Chichester, England. And he must have been an outstanding student. He appears to have had less money than some of the other highly privileged people we've been looking at in our history. And he might not have been able to have afforded to go to college, except for he won many scholarships and was able to go to college based on all the scholarships that he won. While he was an undergraduate, and I guess before then as well, he's someone who learned several languages. And then, as an undergraduate, he published 10 papers on biology, and he translated Wilhelm Wundt's book into English. So he was incredibly productive as an undergraduate. So an outstanding student. And then, as I mentioned, he got his doctoral degree with Wundt. That was in 1892. And he was in the same cohort as Lightner Witmer. So after getting his doctoral degree with Wundt, Titchener gets an offer to move to the United States and join the faculty at Cornell University in New York. And he accepts that offer and joins the faculty at Cornell University. Now, at that time, Cornell University was a brand new university. It was less than 30 years old at this point in history, and it was located in a fairly rural area of New York. I have some pictures on the screen of what Cornell University looked like at this point in history. It almost looks like a kind of a small clump of buildings that's plopped down in a fairly rural area. And I imagine it must have been somewhat of a contrast to the large, grand, old universities with lots of fancy architecture that Titchener was used to in Europe and in England. And Titchener was someone who paid attention to issues of status and prestige, so I don't know if going to Cornell University might have been somewhat of a letdown for him or not. But either way, it was actually where he stayed for the rest of his life. He stayed at Cornell University for his entire career. And here is a picture wearing his academic regalia. I've heard that at the time, it was actually sometimes common for professors to lecture wearing their academic regalia. And if so, Titchener was probably the type of person that would have liked to have done that. He's described as being someone who is powerful, dogmatic, and rigorous. He could be harsh when people stepped out of line, and he was probably a rigorous and demanding professor. He expected his undergraduate students to be able to translate writings of German psychologists, and he used complex mathematical formulas to describe links between stimuli and sensations. And we'll talk about in a moment, he wrote a lab manual called the Experimental Psychology Lab Manual, and the experiments in that manual would have been highly time-consuming. So he appears to be someone who expected quite a bit out of his students.
Sometimes a fire, sometimes a light, sometimes living water like stars in the night. Swirls a kaleidoscope of all that's inside of me, feelings that swell like waves on the sea. May my arms embrace, may I feel in my face laughter and tears and a love that is near. Beauty so vast and beauty
So Titchener is someone that actually had a fairly well-developed theory of psychology, and his theory was called structuralism. And the goal of structuralism was to identify the components of consciousness, identify the components or the elements of conscious experience. That is, he sought to identify the elements of consciousness just as in chemistry there's a table of elements. And he wanted to understand what those elements of consciousness are and what are the rules that govern how they relate to each other to form conscious experience. And so to study consciousness, he made extensive use of that method called introspection. That was the same method that Wundt sometimes used. That's the method where people are exposed to a stimuli, such as maybe a color or a sound or maybe a metronome ticking or something like that. So they're exposed to a stimuli in a very controlled environment. And then as they're exposed to the stimuli, they're supposed to identify the basic elements of their conscious experience. So that's introspection. And Titchener believed this was something that required extensive, rigorous practice. He thought that people actually had to practice maybe over 10,000 introspections. They had to practice over and over again 10,000 times before they're able to use introspection to make valid observations of their own consciousness. Now, a key flaw in the system was that there's no way to objectively validate the conclusions from introspection. One person might do an introspection and say, well, I identified this in my conscious experience. Someone else might do their introspection. They say, well, I identify that in my conscious experience. And it's no way to identify, well, who's right and who's wrong. And what happened was, essentially, Titchener became the person who defined what correct introspections were. If you did introspection and came up with the same conclusions that Titchener thought were correct, well, then you had practiced enough and you were doing it correctly. And if you came up with introspections that disagreed with Titchener, well, then maybe you needed to practice some more because you weren't doing it correct yet. And of course, this is that same type of circular reasoning that can be very problematic. It's the same type of circular reasoning, for example, that Alfred Binet used in his theory of magnetic transfer. If Titchener defines which introspections are correct, there's no way to prove a hypothesis wrong. Notably, structuralism is often described as being the initial, very dominant theory of psychology in the United States. And I think to some degree that's true, but I sometimes wonder if the level of dominance in the United States is somewhat overstated. And I think that's partly because I note that it was actually Titchener's graduate student who wrote the very first history of psychology textbook, and he probably emphasized Titchener's work. And so I'm not sure if it was actually as dominant as it's sometimes portrayed to be, but a lot of times in history, people talk about structuralism as being the first dominant major theory of psychology in the United States. Notably, and I mentioned this previously as well, Titchener described himself as being a devout follower of Wundt. And for many years, people in the United States thought that Wundt was therefore a proponent of structuralism, and they often described Wundt's theory as being structuralism. And like I said before, that's actually not true. It later became apparent that that wasn't true, that Wundt actually did not propose structuralism. Structuralism was really Titchener's thing. And Titchener's approach presumed a much more mechanistic view of consciousness, whereas Wundt believed that people create their own experience. And also, Titchener had a fairly narrow focus on trying to understand conscious experience, whereas Wundt pursued a much broader range of topics, such as myths and culture. And also, I note on the screen that Titchener was in favor of psychology as a pure science. So, for example, we just talked about Münsterberg, who studied topics that had applied value and things that might be able to help people. And this was not what Titchener wanted to do. Titchener thought psychology should be a pure science and not an applied science. He wanted to understand consciousness just for the sake of understanding it, and he didn't think results of psychology would have any applied value. And he thought that if people attempted to try to find applied value for psychology research, they would end up diluting the scientific quality or the scientific rigor of the discipline. And he didn't want that. So he was actually opposed to the idea of psychologists trying to study applied topics, and he thought that psychology should be a pure science. So I describe Titchener's approach as a laboratory psychology where researchers test their own sensation. And we can really get a sense of how this is true if we look at a book that he published. He published an experimental psychology lab manual. And this lab manual actually was used in many universities as a manual for a 2-semester course on research in psychology. And it seems reasonable to presume that this lab manual reflects Titchener's vision of what a science of psychology should encompass. And it also is interesting because it gives us a vision of what it would be like to be a psychology student at this time in history. One thing that's kind of interesting is that although Titchener's structuralism requires introspection, the topic of introspection is actually not discussed anywhere in this lab manual. So I think it would be fair to say that on one hand, Titchener limited psychology to the study of human sensation. But on the other hand, he was clearly not so extreme to suggest that all of psychology should be based on introspection, because he actually didn't even include introspection in his lab manual. So this lab manual was intended to be used for a 2-semester course, and it was a course where students were supposed to work in pairs. So you'd get a partner, and you'd work with that partner for the entire 2-semester sequence. And so students worked in pairs, and they went through a series of experiments. And each experiment involved one person who would be the experimenter, and that person would handle the equipment and write down all the results. And then the other person would be designated as the observer, and that person would give the responses. The observer is what today we would call the participant in the study, or the subject in the study. And a key focus of this work was on identifying the limits of human sensation. It included identifying the lowest limit at which a stimulus produces sensation, and identifying the just noticeable difference between 2 levels of a stimulus. And in his lab manual, Titchener specified highly controlled methods for the experimenter to use to present stimuli to the observer. Often he had several pages of instructions that were presented on how to set up an experiment. For example, the observer might be positioned by placing his head in a chin rest with a patch over one eye, looking through a small hole at a fixation point. I say his because most students would be male at the time. And so in these experiments, Titchener utilized many mechanisms for generating these stimuli. So for example, they'd generate stimuli involving like senses of sound, of vision, time. So examples might include they used tuning forks, metronomes, spinning color wheels, weights. They had a device for controlling the pressure of a horsehair being pressed against the skin. So all different types of mechanisms for generating stimuli for senses of sound, vision, time, and things like that. I have some examples on the screen in front of you here. So here's a device that makes a tone. It's a metal strip that gets clamped in this vise, and if you move it up and down and you flick it, it makes different tones depending on where it's clamped in the vise. Or here's something where an observer looks through that hole in the top and looks down, then you have a spinning color wheel down below, and the observer looks through the hole of the color wheel. Or on the right, I have a device that was, I don't know exactly how it worked, but I assume they put these parts, I guess, got put in your nose, I guess, a device for testing sense of smell. So they had all kinds of devices for presenting stimuli to people, and then they could, the observer would note his experience when that stimuli was presented to him. So most of these experiments involved things that repeated many times. So it was a highly controlled environment, and they involved many repetitions. They do it once and then do it over several times and record your response each time you do it. And the emphasis was on trying to describe links between the stimulus and sensation in a single observer. That is, Titchener was not interested in individual differences. He didn't care if one person might be more sensitive than another. He wanted to describe the experiences of just a single observer at a time. And so he told his students, he gave them specific instructions to not view the experiments as contests measuring their abilities. Although notably, these tests do seem like they could be readily applicable to questions of individual differences, and also testing in applied situations maybe. So it's easy to see, even though on one hand, Titchener was not interested in understanding individual differences, and he told his students to just focus on the sensations of just a single observer and don't try to compare or contrast people. It's easy to see how people might have been drawn to thinking about this, and even how they might have thought, well, could these studies be testing something that might have some kind of applied value? And as we'll see shortly, Lightner Witmer would actually use a lot of the same tradition for testing as a basis for conducting assessments in his clinical psychology. And later on, psychology will evolve to focus on intelligence testing, and a lot of that is based on this foundation of assessing people. The next person is Lightner Witmer, and I describe Witmer's approach as a clinical psychology assessing and treating children with school problems. So let's see how that is. Now, we've been talking about Witmer. He's the person that I said will go on to become the very first clinical psychologist. He's the one that started off studying with Cattell at the University of Pennsylvania. And then when Cattell left, Witmer went and got his doctorate degree with Wundt. And then now he came back to University of Pennsylvania and he joined the faculty there. He took over Cattell's vacated position and he came back in 1892, the same year that Münsterberg and Titchener immigrated to the United States. And as I mentioned, that was the same year as the very first American Psychological Association conference. And that conference was actually held at University of Pennsylvania, where Witmer was. And we do know that Witmer attended that very first APA meeting because he presented a couple papers there. One paper, I believe, was on something about aesthetics, and another was something on reaction times. So he attended that very first APA meeting. Interestingly, we know that Münsterberg and Witmer corresponded around this point in time, and it appears that Münsterberg tried to steal Witmer away from University of Pennsylvania. He gave him a job offer to leave Pennsylvania and move to Harvard. But Witmer appears to have turned that offer down. I imagine that maybe Witmer liked being in charge of the psychology program at University of Pennsylvania, and he knew that if he went to Harvard, he'd have to be working under other people. So he turned that offer down and he stayed at University of Pennsylvania.
Waves on the sea. May my arms embrace, may I feel in my face laughter and tears and a love that is near. Beauty so vast and beauty so wide. Sometimes I pause and tremble inside. Beauty so vast and beauty so wide. Sometimes I pause and tremble inside.
Now, shortly after Witmer arrives at University of Pennsylvania, he takes some initial preliminary steps that will eventually lead him towards developing the new clinical psychology, that will eventually lead him to becoming the very first clinical psychologist. And one of these initial preliminary steps that will lead him in that direction is that he founded something that he called his psychology clinic. And so here's the story of how Witmer founded his new psychology clinic. So, when Witmer first arrived at University of Pennsylvania, his teaching responsibilities included a course on child psychology, and he was teaching a lot of courses for teachers. A lot of the students that would take his courses would be teachers. And one of his students was a woman named Margaret T. McGuire. And Margaret McGuire was a school teacher taking a course with Witmer, and she suggested that Witmer examine one of her students who had a reading difficulty. Note how this could make sense at this point in time, that at this point, psychologists had developed many ways of assessing people. We just looked at Edward Titchener and his experimental psychology lab manual that was full of different ways of assessing people's sensation abilities. And although Titchener didn't think that psychology should be an applied science, it would be easy to think of, well, maybe we could use some of these assessments to assess people, and maybe that would help us understand, say, children who are having learning problems, maybe. And then also, more importantly, especially for Witmer's case, is that Witmer's original advisor was Cattell. And Cattell was a follower of Galton, and Galton had devised a lot of tests, and Cattell had devised his tests, and Cattell had a whole system of Cattell's mental tests that he used for testing all kinds of human traits and abilities. So at this point in history, psychologists had developed a wide range of different methods for assessing people. It's just that at this point, it was mostly assessment done for scientific scientific purposes, and not assessments that were used to try to help people or try to understand people or diagnose problems. But the idea was, well, maybe we could use some of these assessments to try to understand, say, children who are having learning difficulties in school. And that idea probably appealed to Witmer because he had his own experience teaching a boy that had difficulty reading. If you recall, many years earlier, when Witmer was teaching at the Rugby Academy School for Boys, before he started his graduate work, he was trying to help a boy that was having a learning difficulty. So this idea probably appealed to Witmer. So Witmer takes Margaret Maguire's suggestion and he examines her student. And then he begins examining other children with learning problems and also doing some things to try to help them out. So maybe we have Margaret Maguire to thank for her suggestion that would eventually lead to the development of clinical psychology. On the screen is a picture of the Drexel Grammar School, and many of Witmer's early cases came from the school. So now Witmer used the term clinic to describe the place where he conducted his assessments. So that's the beginning of Witmer's psychology clinic. And just to give you a feel for what this clinic was like, we have some notes on the very first case of the child that he treated at his clinic. The notes say that his very first case was a child named Charles Gilman. He was 14 years old, and the primary concern was spelling, but he also had difficulty with reading. And Witmer examined him and he gave him a diagnosis. He diagnosed him with something he called verbal visual amnesia. I'm not exactly sure what that means. It does seem like this child probably had what today we would simply say is some kind of a reading difficulty or maybe a reading disorder. Witmer also reported that the child seemed to have some kind of eye problems based on his assessments, where the child seemed to have a tendency to focus in the wrong location. Witmer did something that led him, some kind of assessments that led him to conclude that the child had what he said was normal intelligence. And he gave some recommendations. He said he recommended the child needs some glasses. He recommended some kind of surgery that might help with his eyes. And he recommended some kind of special training that might help him focus where he needs to focus, although other notes suggest that training might not have helped very much. So that was the very first case in Witmer's psychology clinic. And next we have Stanley Hall. Now, in talking about this first cohort of psychologists in the United States, there were some psychologists in this cohort that were especially strong in voicing support for the idea of eugenics. Now, I'm not aware of any psychologist in this cohort who was opposed to eugenics. I'm not aware of anyone who spoke out against it. But there were some psychologists in this cohort who were very strong in voicing support for eugenics. And the last three psychologists I'm going to talk about are people I will group together because they were all people who were very strong in their support for eugenics. So Stanley Hall was one of the people that was a strong supporter of eugenics. Now, we've talked about Stanley Hall quite a bit before. He's the person that had quite a few things that he was the first at doing. The first person to get a PhD from Harvard, the first person from the United States to study with Wundt, he opened up the very first psychology lab in the United States. He had the very first psychology journal in the United States, the first president of the American Psychological Association, and so forth. So we talked about him quite a bit. And so my description of Stanley Hall is this. His approach was a strongly eugenic developmental psychology seeking links between evolution and development. So let's see how he did that. So Stanley Hall became interested in what today we would probably call developmental psychology. He became interested in how people develop over the lifespan and what are people like when they're children and what are they like when they're adults and so forth. And one thing that was unique about his approach to doing his research is that he used a type of qualitative questionnaire to collect data. Now, his questionnaires were not like the questionnaires we would use today, but it was a type of a questionnaire method that he used for his research. For example, at one point, he wanted to understand fears. He wanted to know what were people afraid of, what were children afraid of, what are adults afraid of, what are common types of fears. And so what he did is he wrote out this prompt, a prompt that would instruct a respondent to write about his or her fears. Basically, instructions to write a paragraph about the things you're afraid of. And so he had this prompt asking people to write about their fears. And then he sent letters to school principals asking them to distribute this prompt to teachers and parents. And the request was that teachers would ask their students to respond to the prompt. And also he wanted teachers and parents to respond to the prompt, both describing their own fears, and also he wanted teachers and parents to respond to the prompt describing what they observed in children, to describe what they saw in terms of children's fears. And so he collected all these prompts, and I think he got over 1,000 responses mailed back to him. So he had all this qualitative data, and he really didn't do any quantitative analysis with this. He didn't turn this into any kind of numerical data. But he did this qualitative analysis and looked at the types of responses he got. And one of his main conclusions was that a fear of falling or a fear of heights is an especially common fear. And then he discussed how this fear is likely a consequence of evolutionary history. There we go. He talked about how that makes sense. It makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, how people might have evolved to experience a fear of heights or a fear of falling, which fits with the theme here, which part of his focus of his approach is looking at links between evolution and development. So he was very interested in evolution. Note, many other psychologists were doubtful of this questionnaire approach. It wasn't a very popular approach at the time, and many other psychologists were doubtful whether you can really obtain valid data by asking untrained laypersons to respond to these types of prompts. But it was something that Stanley Hall used quite a bit. Now, probably the best example of how Stanley Hall sought to find links between evolution and development is in a theory that he had that he called recapitulation theory. So what is recapitulation theory? Well, it's the theory that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is a very fancy, rhythmic sounding, fun thing to say. But what does it mean? So ontogeny is just another fancy word for development. So if I talk about the ontogeny of a person, that's the same thing as saying, what's the development of a person? How does a person develop over the lifespan? And by phylogeny, he's talking about the evolutionary history of a species. So if he says ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, the idea is that the development of a single person, say as a single person starts maybe before birth to childhood to adolescence to adulthood, that the stages a person goes through in his or her development matches or follows or is parallel with the stages that humans went through in the evolutionary development of the human species. So before birth, the child's kind of like a pre-human form, and then maybe a child is kind of a very early type of human evolution, and then adults are more the current form of human evolution. So the idea is ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that is the development of a single person matches the development of the human species. And that was Stanley Hall's recapitulation theory. He also talked about, he had wrote a book on adolescence, and part of his theory about the period of time adolescence, he talked about adolescence being a very unique part of development for humans. And he talked about adolescence being a time of storm and stress. And that was Stanley Hall's idea, that adolescence is a time of storm and stress. And actually in 1891, he started another journal. So he already started the first psychology journal. He started another journal in 1891 called Pedagogical Seminary, which is essentially a journal on child development. Pedagogical is like for teaching, and the idea was that a primary reason for studying children would be to find ways to improve teaching methods. And so a journal on pedagogical journal would be a journal on child development. And seminary is just a fancy word for journal. I suppose a lot of things here, he uses fancy words for things. So Pedagogical Seminary is essentially a journal on child development, and he started that journal in 1891. So we see how his focus, he focused on issues regarding development. So he looked at a developmental psychology, and a lot of his theory looked at links between development and evolution was a key theme in how he did his research. Now let's look at Stanley Hall's views on race and eugenics. So, as I mentioned, Stanley Hall was a strong, enthusiastic supporter of eugenics. And we also previously talked a little bit about some of his views on race. Recall that we talked about the time when he taught courses at Wilberforce University. That's that historically black university, and he taught black students there. But he did so from the perspective that white people were superior to black people. And it seems that all throughout his entire life, Stanley Hall kind of had this attitude that he felt it was his responsibility to educate black people, but he did so from a perspective that white people were superior to black people. So he felt it was his responsibility to educate what he saw as an inferior race of people. And his ideas on race are also evident in his recapitulation theory that I just mentioned a moment ago. So he thought that races of people can be placed on a kind of a linear scale of psychological cultural development, and that different stages of development for different races could be mapped onto stages of development, of evolutionary development for the human species. So in other words, he would use stages of human evolution. He'd use these stages of human evolution not only to describe stages of human development, but also difference between races. So Hall believed that non-white races represented an earlier stage of human evolutionary development, and that white people represented the most recent stage of human evolutionary development. So his recapitulation theory had some very strong racist components built into it. Let me give you a quote from Hall that will help us get a view on some of his attitudes towards race. So here's one quote from Stanley Hall. He says, "The Negro has some excellent traits which the whites lack, including his rich emotional life, his cheerfulness, more intense religious nature, and keener and more sympathetic appreciation of nature." This is the type of thing we've heard before, where people have an attitude that there's a substantive difference between black people and white people. And they say, well, the black people have these traits that are really the traits nobody wants, and the white people get all the good traits. So this implies that there's a difference between black and white people. And it's kind of like, well, the black people get the consolation prize, that they're a cheerful race of people. And this implies that maybe white people then have traits like intelligence and perseverance and achievement. All the good traits presumably then go to the white people. So we see that Stanley Hall certainly had some very clearly racist ideas in the things that he proposed. So next I have James McKean Cattell. And my description for Cattell is that he pursued a strongly eugenic mental test psychology measuring individual differences. And we already talked quite a bit about Cattell, so at this point it might be obvious how his approach can be described as a mental test psychology measuring individual differences. Recall, he was the one that developed a program of what he called his mental tests. And these tests were used to measure all kinds of different human traits and abilities. And recall that Cattell was a follower of Francis Galton. And Galton also had his anthropometric laboratory where he measured all kinds of human traits and abilities. And both Cattell and Galton thought they were measuring traits that were adaptive, that were important for human evolution, and traits that might be passed down from one generation to the next. They were interested in issues of heredity. They wanted to understand how these traits might be inherited and passed down from one generation to the next. And given that Galton was a person who invented the idea of eugenics, and that Cattell was a strong follower of Galton, it's not surprising that Cattell was a strong supporter of the idea of eugenics. And let's see, actually here is another picture I have of Cattell, and just a note I have about here, Cattell as father, which will actually illustrate his approach to this idea of eugenics. And this actually goes back to originally when Cattell was growing up. When he was a child, Cattell's father offered him $1,000 if he didn't drink or smoke. Now, Cattell used kind of a similar parenting strategy with his children, but for a different purpose. So Cattell had 7 children, and he offered each of his 7 children $1,000 if they married the child of a professor. And that would fit his eugenics agenda, because the idea would be that the child of a professor would be a very intelligent person, so that would be a superior type of person, and it would be good if his children married superior types of people and had babies, because then they would be likely to be superior babies. So that kind of gives you some further insight into the ways that he supported eugenics. And one final note about Cattell is that several years later, actually in 1921, he established a company called the Psychological Corporation, which is a corporation that's still around today, and it's the company that publishes the Wechsler intelligence scales, which is probably the most widely used intelligence scale used today. So that is James McKeen Cattell. So the final person I want to talk about in discussing this first cohort of psychologists in the United States is this person here, Edward Thorndike. And my description of Edward Thorndike is that he pursued a strongly eugenic psychology of learning, quantifying how cats and people learn. Now, we have not talked about Edward Thorndike at all yet, and he was actually still an undergraduate student, say at the time of the first APA conference that year when Witmer and Titchener and Münsterberg all came to the United States. And so he might be better described as entering psychology just a couple years after this first cohort. But he's such an interesting character, and he did some rather unique things, so I wanted to include him in this group. So now Thorndike, when he was still an undergraduate student, he read William James' textbook that he had just published, that Principles of Psychology textbook that James published. So Thorndike read that book and he was inspired by it. He really liked it. And so he enrolled in Harvard as a graduate student to work with William James. And recall that William James, one of his interests was psychical phenomena, things like seances and ghosts and things like that. And so along this line, Thorndike's first research project that he pursued at Harvard was he did research on mind reading in children. He wanted to see if children could read his mind. And so he did a study where he asked children to try to read his mind, and he told them, if you can read my mind, I'll give you candy, which might have been rather frustrating for the children. And as you might imagine, that study didn't go so well, so he was looking for another research topic to pursue. And then something rather interesting happened. So there was this person named Lloyd Morgan, who was a European ethologist, that is someone who does research on the behavior of animals. And Morgan visited Harvard and gave a lecture. It was a lecture that Thorndike attended. And the lecture was on trial and error learning in animals. And Thorndike got really inspired by this. He liked it, and it prompted Thorndike to want to do research on the intelligence of chickens. So he got some chickens, and he kept them in his room where he lived. Well, actually, he kept them in his room until his landlady complained about the chickens in his room. But then William James said that Thorndike could keep the chickens in his own cellar, so he moved the chickens to James' cellar. Now, note this illustrates how the definition of psychology at this point in history is still rather fluid, because at this point in time, there's not really anybody else who identifies as a psychologist who's doing research on animals. But at the same time, it appears that this was viewed as a perfectly fine topic for a psychology graduate student to pursue. I kind of imagine Thorndike asking his mentor, William James, hey, can I do some research on chicken intelligence? And William James going, oh, well, yeah, sure, I guess, why not? Or something like that. So anyway, he does his research with chickens. He made some pens to keep the chickens in, and if the chickens could escape from the pens, they could get food or water or company with other chickens. So he was looking at how chickens might learn to escape from these pens to gain water or food or company. And the chickens indeed learned to escape over time. Now, he was working on that for a while, but eventually he actually leaves Harvard before completing his graduate degree and goes to Columbia University. He actually accepts an assistantship that was offered by Cattell. So he stops Harvard with James and moves to Columbia University with Cattell. And he starts work with Cattell. And the story is actually that the thing that prompted his move was that he had proposed marriage to a woman named Elizabeth Moulton, and she had rejected his marriage proposal, and he felt really sad about that, and so he wanted to change locations, and that's what prompted him to move from Harvard to Columbia. But for whatever reason, he goes to Columbia University and picks up his graduate work with Cattell there. And he moves to Columbia, and the story is he takes his 2 most highly trained chickens with him, and he goes to Columbia and he wants to continue his research with his chickens. Once again, he keeps them in his room, and at one point there's almost some kind of accident that nearly causes a fire. His landlady kicks the chickens out of his apartment once again, but then Cattell found space in an attic where he could keep his chickens. And then he starts expanding on to other animals, and he moves from chickens to cats. And so he starts doing research on cats, and that leads to some very famous studies that Thorndike did with cats. So Thorndike's research with cats involved something he called a cat puzzle box. So he did a series of cat puzzle box studies, and this research actually became his dissertation, and it's also the research that he's most famous for. So for his studies, he had 7 kittens and 6 young cats, and he had 15 different puzzle boxes. And a puzzle box was a contraption box that he could put a cat inside of the puzzle box. And if the cat were to hit the right series of levers or latches, a door would open and the cat would be allowed to escape. And so what he did is he'd put a cat in the puzzle box and he'd simply observe the cat's behavior. And what he observed was that at first the cat simply engaged in what appeared to be a lot of trial and error behavior, just random behaviors. And it took a long time, but eventually the cat would flip the right set of levers, the door would open, the cat would escape. And then he'd put the cat back in the puzzle box and do it over and over again. And over time, eventually, the cat would learn to escape very rapidly. And so based on his observations, he came up with something he called the law of effect. So the law of effect, that's Thorndike's law of effect based on his puzzle box research. And essentially the law of effect is simply his idea of how animals learn. And his theory is that animals engage in random behavior, and then a response either leads to an annoyer or a satisfier, and responses that produce satisfiers are stamped in. So that's Thorndike's law of effect, and it's his idea of how animals learn. That animals learn because they just engage in random behaviors, and then if a response leads to a satisfier, that gets stamped in and they start doing that response more and more. Notably, that's somewhat similar to some ideas that get suggested later on in behaviorism, which will be a big theory in psychology later on, but behaviorism is still a ways down the road yet, and Thorndike's ideas are not exactly like behaviorism. Now, one thing that's interesting about Thorndike's law of effect in his work is that this is something that is often discussed in textbooks. And many times textbooks will talk about Thorndike's law of effect. And when they do, they often have a picture of what a puzzle box looked like. And so on the screen here, you see a typical depiction of one of Thorndike's puzzle boxes that he used in his research. And the thing that's interesting here is that actually, we have pictures of what Thorndike's puzzle boxes really looked like, and they looked nothing like this. They were nowhere this neat. So let me show you. Here I have some pictures. Let's see. Here's one picture. Here's one of his actual puzzle boxes that he used in one of his studies, and that certainly is not a very neat-looking contraption. Let's see. Here's another one. Another puzzle box, kind of the same thing. Looks like he has random scraps of wood that he's nailed together. And here we go. Let's see, another one here. There's another one. That one almost looks a little bit neater, but still the wood doesn't look like it's cut very neatly there. And then I think I have one final one there. So there's another final. So just like he has kind of contraptions comprised of scrap material pieced together with shoddy construction, got nails sticking out. So that's what his puzzle boxes really looked like. And so using those puzzle boxes, he determines his law of effect. He completes his dissertation. And actually, there's a happy ending to that as well, because he had proposed to Elizabeth Moulton, and she had originally turned him down. But actually now she agreed to marry him. And so Thorndike and Elizabeth Moulton get married after all. So in my descriptive phrase for Thorndike, I say he was quantifying how cats and people learn. But up to this point, I've only talked about cats. Well, cats and chickens, but I haven't talked about people yet. And as it turns out, after Thorndike graduated, he went on to conduct a research program focusing on education and intelligence testing in people. So his later research focused on learning in people. And also in my descriptive phrase, I say he was quantifying how cats and people learn. And I use that word quantifying intentionally because Thorndike became a very strong advocate for doing quantitative data analysis in psychological research. He thought if we're doing psychological research, we should be making assessments, turning those assessments into numerical values so that we can do a quantitative data analysis to reach our research conclusions. So he was a big advocate for quantifying our assessments, for doing quantitative data analysis. Here's a quote on your screen that's attributed to Thorndike about that issue. He says, "All that exists in some amount and can be measured." So that was his quote, that he's emphasizing the importance to measure things and quantify them as part of psychological research. Now, I also mentioned that Thorndike was a strong advocate for eugenics. So let's consider his views on race and heredity and eugenics. So he was a strong supporter of eugenics, and his research program, he focused on learning, and he believed that intelligence was defined as an ability to learn. So his research could be described as research on intelligence and learning. And he believed that intelligence was primarily determined by heredity, and he believed that black people have evolved to have less intelligence than white people. But he thought that regardless of someone's intelligence, education is always valuable. So he was a bit like Stanley Hall in that he thought it was valuable to provide education to black people, but he thought that white people were still superior to black people. I'll read you a quote from Thorndike to give you a sense of what his viewpoint was on race. So at one point he writes, "We may even expect that education will be doubly effective once society recognizes how there are advantages given to some and denied to others by heredity. That men have different amounts of capacity does not imply any less advantage from or need of wise investment. If it be true, for example, that the Negro is by nature unintellectual and joyous, this does not imply that he may not be made more intelligent by wiser training. It does mean that we should be stupid to expect the same result from him that we should expect from an especially intellectual race like the Jews." So we close out our discussion of this first cohort of the first psychologists in the United States by remembering the extent to which, at this point in history, racism was steeped into the academic world.